What's going on, my pondering people? Welcome to Pondering Christianity. Here we tackle near-death experiences, Christian apologetics, and things like deathbed visions. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We would love to have you to get involved with some of these awesome conversations. That being said, this week's video is on NDEs, confirming the Christian moral defense. And obviously, I'll explain a lot more what that means. But one quick announcement, there's only a couple days left to get your Pondering Christianity t-shirt. I'm running it through Bonfire. This is the first time running the campaign. So if you want to support the channel, that's going to be the best way for you to do that for me right now. So without further ado, let's get into this week's topic. This has been something that I've wanted to do a video on for a while now. And the reason being is because of how much NDEs, near-death experiences, change the perception of this life. And that's what makes them so profound as stories in the lives of the people who experience them, but also in the lives of people who read them or study them, because these people seem to come back with this new perception of reality. And so that has a large sweeping influence over how people perceive life, how people think meaning is achieved. And so what I wanted to do over time, as I began to see this habit kind of present itself within these stories and within the research itself, I mean, it even changes the researcher's life, is I could start to see how this information would very much reinforce the position that I had seen from moral arguments for God. And in that, I'll briefly summarize them, that most people want to critique God and say, look, if God is all loving and all powerful, why doesn't he stop, let's say, a child from getting cancer, or a baby dying on the other side of the world, or any kind of atrocity that you can think of that you would hope God would step in? Now, the thing is we know that the reason God will permit these things is because there's a greater good that's being accomplished, and the best good is ultimately what we want to see a God who's all loving look to achieve. The most loving thing sometimes can be perceived in the moment as an unloving thing, and I'll provide you a quick example of, as a child, my parents would take me to the dentist, right? And I hate the dentist, right? Who doesn't, right? But you got to go, right? You need your teeth. And so my parents, and I didn't know any better, right? I just thought I was going there and being subjected to this torture for no reason. But as you grow older, you find that you get fillings so that those cavities don't become crowns, and then those crowns don't become root canals, and those root canals go further, right? So you find that you're trading off this inconvenience of getting this filling, and ultimately to avoid a more severe operation to prevent, tooth decay or gum decay or like jaw decay or something insane like that. I'm not a dentist, so forgive me if I got that incorrect. But nonetheless, the point stands that we will sometimes trade a quick burst, a small amount of evil or a small amount of bad or pain or inconvenience in exchange for a greater amount of good, a greater level of good that can be accomplished. And the greatest good of all is love, and that cannot be accomplished if the person who you want to love you doesn't have the choice to not love you. Okay? So that's the framework in which most Christians will paint the moral defense for God, of simply saying, God has to respect man's ability to make bad decisions, but God can ultimately take those bad decisions, such as that small amount of pain, and turn that into a greater good over the long time period. Now, where this is complicated is that God is an eternal being, and he sees all things at all times. We can only see what's in front of us right now, or what has happened to us. We can't see what's going to happen in the future. We can't see if God's going to take a baby who is dying over in Africa from cancer, or in the United States from cancer, or whatever. We can't see how that might ripple into some amazing good being accomplished over the long time frame. But even then, it does leave you with this question that prods at your conscience of, why does that one person have to suffer for the good of everyone else, right? And so that's where near-death experiences really excel in showing us something a little bit more, right? Showing us there's a little bit more to that story, and there's a little bit more to that theory than you might think. And so let's get into it. NDEs confirm Christian morality defenses, and I'm going to explain why. So through the study of near-death experiences and through obviously the study of apologetics and within the biblical sense, you can kind of look at the defenses within the Bible. But you see these planes of existence. You guys have to forgive me. I just realized that color scheme's not that great for the color, but I'll explain. So there seems to me 3 planes of existence, and I reserve the right to change my opinion on this at any time, but this is what I'm convinced of currently. There's 3 planes of existence: time, space, matter, the physical material plane. Then there's the spiritual plane, and that's where heaven and hell exist, okay? And then finally, God. God is the third plane because all things come from God. He is the first or final, however you want to look at it, first or final plane of existence. And then all things stem from that. Now, what is reported in near-death experiences, and you could see some biblical language to kind of account for this. Paul talks a lot about how obviously heaven's ineffable. Like, it's difficult to talk about because of it's such a profound experience. And one of the major contributors to this seems to be you have this new level of awareness. So on this plane, we have 5 senses. Okay, we have our see, smell, taste, touch, hear. Okay, see, smell, taste, touch, hear. Yeah, so 5, right? But on the next plane of existence, on the higher or lower level plane of existence, lower in this picture, but I would say it's a higher level of existence because you have more senses available to you. Communication is different. The way that you interact with people is different. Emotion is felt at a much greater intensity. And so this plane of existence seems to be, for all intents and purposes, a higher level of reality. Now, why is that a relevant observation? This is a relevant observation for the reason that when you're looking at your life, okay, you're trying to determine what is the ultimate reality. Like, we might have a nightmare, for example. You might have a nightmare, but then you wake up from that into a reality, okay? And you're kind of heartbroken over this nightmare, but then you come to reality, and then reality begins to overwhelm that nightmare, right? Because you just have a greater level of input from your senses. Now, in the same instance, perhaps you hate your reality, okay? And you have a beautiful dream, right? And that dream just puts you in such a great state of mind, but then you come back to reality, and reality begins to overwhelm that, okay? This dream plane, if you will. And so that is a relevant observation in this conversation because for all intents and purposes, you could call time, space, and matter a dream. And to further back up that theory, you have near-death experiencers referring to this life as a dream once they've experienced that plane of existence because of the senses they have, the interactions they have, the visceral experience that they go through shows that this plane of existence is very close to what we would call a dream. And so that begins to sort of shape the actions and the reality of this plane. Now, I'm not saying that this life is the equivalent of a dream, but what I am saying is that when you look at things that happen within a dream or a nightmare and the things that happen within real life, the things that happen in a dream or nightmare are impactful. They can be very impactful, but they're not as impactful as things happening in your real life. A traumatic event, if a family member dies in a dream, that's traumatic in a dream, or a nightmare rather, but it's not going to be as traumatic as that person dying in real life. And so in the same sense, the gravity in which the difference in gravity of the two actions is significantly more on the spiritual plane. And so that begins to shape this idea that perhaps we should be observing good and evil and what is the best option for everybody on the spiritual plane, if in fact that theory is true, which I believe it is. And so I think that begins to lend a lot of credence to why we have the moral defense for God being in the spiritual plane of he's operating on a understanding of I want the best amount of good to come out of this higher level of existence, and I'm not as concerned with the lower level of existence if it means a cost of the spiritual plane, okay? Now, there's 2 planes of good and evil, okay? You have the physical, the finite planes of existence of good and evil, and then you have spiritual, eternal planes of good and evil. And so what we see is Jesus is calling us to love our neighbors as ourselves. In this great commandment, he provides us this outline of essentially how to live this life. Okay, if you love your neighbor, if you love your neighbor as much as yourself, and if you love God as much as yourself, you're going to be good to go. You really are. I mean, if you're going to love them with as much intensity as you can, you're going to find that life really does a great job of taking care of itself. It's when we become selfish that our actions become destructive. And so what I wanted to continue to push into the idea here, or push into the conversation, is that actions that we do in this life matter 100%. They matter. And this is confirmed by things like life review, and even in biblical text, there's mention of judgment and coming before God and being judged by the standard by which you judge others. And there's this idea that the actions you're committing in this life seem to have a reality beyond just this life. They seem to echo and continue perpetuating forward. And this is confirmed again I think there's a lot of biblical support for the idea that our actions now have meaning into eternity. And not only that, near-death experiencers also confirm this, because when they come back, they discuss how their life review showed every thought, every movement, every action that they took had a long-lasting effect, like a ripple effect, a butterfly effect. It might be a small action in the moment, but it ripples forward and it hits another thing and hits another thing, and the action continues to, the domino effect, it continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. Yes, there's single dominoes falling, but the dominoes as a conglomerate become a larger sequence of actions. And so you have those two things. You have the domino individually by itself falling, but then you also have the dominoes as a collective falling and creating something larger, right? So the idea that I'm trying to get at here is, again, the actions we have in this life echo into eternity. And this matters when you're looking at morality, because what we determine to be good and what we determine to be evil should be affected by this eternal lens. Okay, that's going to be the best way to look at our actions, and that's going to be the best way to interpret the way that God interfaces with us. Because if we look at it with a finite view, then we don't quite understand the entire ramifications of the discussion. Okay, and so this is why this is so pivotal, is because if you really want to get a good beat on what God is trying to do in your life, or what God has done in someone else's life, or whatever, right? If you're trying to better understand God and his motivators, then your best plan of attack is to look at it in an eternal existence. You'll see here, I've designed this little graph to show, good, and then how our good life, dips down and comes up, right? And that's just to show that Christians fail in some regard, but Christ ultimately gives us the ability to do what's going to be in the best interest of everyone in the eternal long run. Now, evil causes us to think that we're having the greatest life because we're pursuing selfish actions. We're pursuing a selfish nature where we want to be God, right? And so that leads us to believe we're going in the right direction. But then you see we just take a steep drop off once death hits, and then we drop into hell, and our existence becomes eternally our own, right? And so in that sense, you can see physical death happens so early on that you don't quite appreciate the level of good that's trying to be accomplished within your existence until you begin to take into consideration eternity. In physical death, think about this, right? Like, let's say the average human being is living to be 80 years old, okay? And that's why I've moved the dot there. That's the 80-year mark, okay? And eternity goes on for eternity. You can see how it doesn't make sense, right, for us to care, right, about that tiny portion of this massive chart, right? Why do we care so much about what's happening in our physical existence, right, when we have this eternal existence to care about so much more? Right? And that doesn't mean that you don't care about this life. If anything, it elevates the level of care that you have for this life, because you now understand that this life is not all that there is. And so it provides better context as to how this life should be lived. It is interesting to see things when Jesus talks about the last shall be first in the kingdom of heaven, how he's referring to people learning that relationships and putting other people first are really going to be the winners, right? Versus these people who are selfish and think that life is all about them winning and their personal glory. Then they find that their concentration on the small plane of existence ultimately leads in eternal death. But that's a conversation for another time. Ultimately, I'm just trying to point out the idea of why do we spend so much time caring about this plane of existence when if you want to critique God, if you want to look at morality and you want to ask God why he's doing what he's doing, you really have to take into consideration the eternal existence and the eternal effect of good and evil. And if you're trying to say that God's doing something evil, you have to think about what God's taking into consideration. God cares about all of this, okay? Even the people in hell. God cares about these people. Now, here's the thing. He's so concerned with all of this that his actions and what he allows to happen and what he allows to happen in your life, he's taking into consideration, will it result in the best amount or the most amount of good along this long plane of existence? And if it will, then he's going to permit something bad happening in the short plane of existence that we call physical life, right? That is the context in which we should look at God, his actions, good and evil. And this is why near-death experiences are so cool to study, because they confirm that this is in fact the actual reality that we're in, is that we have this understanding of such finite action. Yet we want to put such a level of care and concern into like politics, right? Or being written down into history books or anything like that. So ultimately, I think it's really important for us to think about when we want to look at God's actions, when we want to understand why he's doing what he's doing, it's important for us to think about the long game, okay? And even in this life, if someone makes decisions, right? If I give someone $1,000 and they go and they spend it all immediately, you'd be like, that person's rash, or I suppose it would depend on what they spent it on. But if they just went and blew it on a bunch of temporary stuff, right, like candy and games and movies and experiences that might be finite, you would look at that person and you'd be like, man, you're so rash. You make these decisions without considering the ramifications of the long term, right? You're so short-sighted. And this is an honest critique of someone, right? Well, that's what God thinks of us and the things that we are concerned with. He thinks that we're short-sighted, that we're concerned with things that really won't matter in the long run, that we get so caught up in the moment that we forget that there's a greater, much deeper plan at play. And that's what's so great about these conversations, is they bring to light the idea that God does have a much grander plan at play. And sometimes we just have to back up and try to see the full game or full plan or full picture to really get a good idea as to what God's trying to do in our lives. So that's why I think near-death experiences are They confirm the Christian moral defense, because they just reinforce what Christianity tells us in that the concerns of this life should not be material possessions. They should be things that are stored up within heaven, which is actions inspired by the Holy Spirit. Now, if you're a skeptic and you're kind of looking at this conversation, I would urge you to consider the evidence that near-death experiences add to the Christian defense of the moral defense of God. So if you're trying to maybe battle back and forth with the moral arguments as it pertains to God, and you want to look in it, and someone has near-death experiences come in as evidence in that conversation, you should definitely consider how they're reinforcing the position the Christian's trying to state of, yes, there might be evil that happens here and now, but that's finite, tiny, small amounts of evil compared to this infinite plan that God has for us, our lives, and ultimately the things that we want to accomplish. And so I would urge you to really consider the evidence that near-death experiences provide, especially when it comes to the moral defense of God and ultimately his actions and the actions in our lives and what should really matter. That concludes this week's video. If you guys liked it, do me a favor, give it a like. Comment what you thought. If you disagree, comment what you disagree with. Tell me, explain your point. I'd love to interact with you guys. Remember, those shirts are going to go away here soon. I'll place the link in the description so you guys can go get yours. That'd be a huge help and support to the channel. And if nothing else, if you want to support the channel, just subscribe. That would be the biggest help. Maybe share a video, go watch some other videos. That would also be a massive help. In the meantime, you already know, keep on pondering. See you next time.